Good morning, and today's topic is about war crimes under public international law. And before we begin, as always, I want to emphasize that this educational project, LexClassroom, is totally independent from my legal job, which is a litigator, and also I'm a professor of the University of Cebu School of Law. And this project is aimed at helping our law students, our bar reviewees, and new lawyers and even the general public so that the knowledge of the law would be available for everyone. And we are looking at the possibility of having this project in the local languages, just like Cebuano, Hiligaynon, Waray, and among others in the Philippines. Now, our topic again is about war crimes. We will be explaining war crimes based on these sources, and you can visit the two websites or the links that I wrote in this slide. Now, before anything else, we have to remember that there's no single document under public international law that codifies all war crimes. So it's a progression, depends on the historical timeline, the events, especially World War One, World War Two, and if you go to the present or the current events, one would be the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Now, sources of war crimes definition, its punishment, and the laws applicable to it would be the following set of sources. In public or international humanitarian law treaties, international criminal law treaties, and international customary law. So these are the two main sources. And if you look back, or if we look back at Article 38 of the Rome Statute, it lists down the sources of international law, and number one there would be treaties, and among others also would be international customary law. Now, these are the significant treaties. When we say treaties, these are agreements entered into by states and even public international law actors such as the United Nations, which is not considered a state but considered as a juridical entity with a personality under public international law, and it can act and with its actions have consequences. Now, the Hague Conventions, or back in the 1899 and 1907, and these conventions focus on the prohibition to warring parties to use certain means and methods of warfare. But since we know that no civilization will thrive without rules and regulations. So it's, although we say or others would assume that, oh, when you say war, there should be no law applicable. However, in order also to avoid the possibility of another world war or to avoid unnecessary damage among parties, there should still be rules of law or laws of war during the conflict. So this is a way to limit the unnecessary damage or harm, and to also avoid unnecessary human suffering. As much as possible, the ideal in a society is the absence of war, especially an armed conflict. Now, another significant treaty would be the Geneva Convention of 1864, 1949, and the two additional protocols back in 1977. These conventions and the additional protocols, meaning there's the existing convention or treaty or agreement of states, then there's an added significant term which parties are not actually mandated to readily accept the protocols because by agreement this is consensual. So states are allowed to refuse agreement or not agree or not consent to such additional protocol. So again, these four, or the conventions and the additional two protocols, focus on the protection of persons not or no longer taking part in hostilities. So these group of people must be protected. One example would be the civilians and those no longer, or the wounded. They're no longer considered taking part of the hostilities, especially when they are wounded, or especially the military personnel. Now, we have a very important and recent convention or treaty, the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute was agreed or entered into by states in order to prosecute the most serious crimes of international concern. And if you look at the Rome Statute, there are four major crimes, and this is a way to end impunity, meaning the lack of sense of responsibility and the lack of fear that the crime will go unpunished. So there are people who do the crime because they think that, oh, I will not be punished, just like in our domestic situation or in our internal situation here in the Philippines, that if you know that there's no punishment to the misconduct, then you will be encouraged even to do it, since there's no rule or there's no regulation that would punish or that would impose a liability. One, for example, which is very simple. If there's no signage that there should be no jaywalking, even when the lights are red, and not even in the pedestrian, one would continue jaywalking. But if you know that there's a signage saying that no jaywalking is allowed in this area, then one is discouraged from doing the act. So the Rome Statute is, in a way, doing its purpose because it lays down the punishment of a particular crime. Example would be crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. It's the first international criminal law instrument that recognizes forms of sexual violence such as rape, slavery, enforced prostitution, and enforced sterilization as distinct war crimes. If we go back again to history during the World War II, there was enforced prostitution practice, especially the invading Japanese forces in the Philippines. And I still remember my grandmother, maternal grandmother, and also our neighbors who lived during the war and who were victims also of the abuse. But I did not hear any prosecution, and my grandmother had died already, even without seeing the crimes during the Japanese occupation in the Philippines were punished. Okay, so much of that. Let's continue. The Rome Statute under Article 8 states that the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, because if we look back, the Rome Statute created the International Criminal Court, and this is a specialized court aside from the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. We have the International Criminal Court, which has exclusive jurisdiction only for international um, crimes. One of that would be war crimes. And when can an act be considered as a war crime? When it is committed as part of a plan or policy, or as part of a large scale commission of such crimes. And I remember the time when I was researching for the mooting team of the University of Cebu School of Law, and we competed the ICRC. Um, I forgot already. 2011. We were in Hong Kong, the Philippines. We represented the Philippines, and I'm one of the researchers. And the prosecutor versus Popovich case. It states that one thing that separates war crime from the other crimes defined under public international law is the fact that it is part of a plan or policy, or is a part of a large scale commission of such crime. And these are committed by leaders or the ones with authority over another person, especially um, chief executive and even military officers having the ascendancy among the other personnels. Now, it provides Article 8. Let's go back to Article 8. It provides the definition of war crimes and the listing of acts that would constitute war crimes under public international law. So, and also when I handled public international law, I always make sure that the manual for international criminal law would be read by my students, because there each of the elements. And speaking of elements, later we will tackle what are the major elements of war crimes. So, but first, what are war crimes? War crimes under public international law are violations of international humanitarian law or treaty or customary international law that incur individual criminal responsibility under international law. So there is an individual involved, the person is punished, and such punishment could be imprisonment or the payment of a fine, since death penalty is not allowed even under international law, although there are jurisdictions that still allow or as one of the punishments is death. Now, another way to demarcate war crimes from another public international law crime or public international crime would be it must take place in the context of an international or non-international armed conflict. So it's not an ordinary conflict because it should be an armed conflict. So belligerents like warring like or insurgents could against the state, if there's an armed conflict, meaning there are arms taken like guns, weapons, or cannons even. So if these even machetes could be considered, like the ones during the Rwanda genocide. So this could also be considered as an armed conflict because it doesn't say that armed should be guns. So, and you have to remember also that again, the armed conflict could be international or non international. By international, we say two warring states. By non international, we say that within the domestic affairs, and the other party is considered as an insurgent or a belligerent, could be a belligerent group. Now, based on this definition, there are four categories under public international law of war crimes. And specifically, what the Rome Statute says are these classifications or categories, rather. Now, first would be the grave breaches of 1949 Geneva Conventions related to international armed conflict. I want to emphasize armed. Second would be other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in international and armed conflict, and serious violations of Article 3 common to the four 1949 Geneva Conventions related to armed conflict, not of an international character. So it's best, and I advise students especially, that you look into the full text of these conventions, although it's a long reading. And lastly, other serious violations of laws and customs applicable in armed conflict, not of an international character. So the common element, it should be an armed conflict, but it's not even necessary that the armed conflict is international in character. Now, so there are divisions even of war crimes because War crimes could be either of these divisions. It could be acts that are against persons requiring particular protection. One example would be the killing of a civilian who is not a participant to the hostilities. Second, against those providing humanitarian assistance and peacekeeping operations, like part of the UN peacekeeping forces. I remember in one of my flights going to Europe, one of the passengers that I met during the flight was part of the UN peacekeeping forces who were assigned in East Timor during the independence when East Timor was trying to gain independence from Indonesia, and crimes against property and other rights. Example would be the destruction of a religious building because religious buildings are not considered as military objectives, so it should be excluded from being targeted. And prohibited methods of warfare and prohibited means of warfare, just like the use of nuclear weapons, which is not allowed under international law. And one of the controversial issues that involved the Ukraine versus Russia conflict would be the possible use or threat of nuclear weapons, such that the UN is very, very alarmed in case there is use of nuclear weapons either of the parties, although it's expected that since Russia has its own nuclear weapons, then most probably Russia would be using the same, but we still cannot tell as of the moment. Now, so what are the two? I was talking about the elements of a crime. Under our criminal justice system in the Philippines, we also have the mens rea and the actus reus. As we always, the other night, my student was answering a legal profession question through the principles of um, criminal law principles or method, because the subject prior to my class was criminal law. So, and I was telling the student, oh, you're answering my question based in the context of criminal law, and the student could not deny it. Okay, going back. The first element would be the contextual element. So, what's the situation? What's the context? So, the crime or the conduct should take place in the context of and was associated again with an international or non international armed conflict. And aside from the context, you also have to include the mental element. This is now the person, the actor is involved here, that there is intent and knowledge both with regard to the individual act and the contextual element. One example would be chief executives of a leader of a country, or the leader of the insurgents, or the belligerent state that could be possible. So within the context that there's an armed conflict, and what if that person intends to harm civilians who are not taking part in the hostilities, so that person could be liable, personally liable of war crimes. Now, one example, or I'm giving you three examples here of war crimes so that you will have a better understanding. Torture or inhuman treatment, it's not allowed. During an international or non international armed conflict, there should be no torture because torture is prohibited under public international law by treaty and by international customary law. So that would include biological experiments. And one example, during the time of the Nazis, Hitler ordered the biological experiments involving the Jews. So that was not allowed. and the taking part of hostages, because again, there's no it's taking of hostages is not necessary to advance the cause or the intent of the warring parties. So there's no really reason to have these as collateral damage, not even a collateral damage, because you're using them as a leverage to advance your forces. So it's not allowed. Taking of hostages usually is made to cover or to protect the militants or the military personnel taking part in the hostilities, so that they will not be subjected or targeted as a military objective. Now, another would be intentionally directing attacks against civilian population. I was mentioning this a while ago. And these persons must not be taking direct part in hostilities. But if they're just protecting themselves to be safe from the armed persons, then that's fine. But if they will be stripped off of such protection if they're directly taking part in the hostilities. And one sad thing, I watched a documentary about children serving or being forced to be part of the African militias. So that's one thing that another issue under public international law. Then those attacks that may be against personal installations, materials, units, or vehicles involved in a humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping missions in accordance with the UN Charter. The ambush of the members of the UN peacekeeping forces is not allowed under international law, because the members of the peacekeeping mission under the UN Charter, they're considered as neutral. So they're allowed passage and they should not be considered as military objectives. Attacks against buildings dedicated, I was mentioning this also a while ago, to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, provided they are not military objectives. And I remember back in February when uh, the Ukraine versus Russia conflict was still at an early stage. I remember that the people, the Ukrainians, were wrapping up the monuments, the public monuments of their heroes, their important, even the museums, the curators were trying to hide the valuable um, objects inside the museum so as to save it from damage or from attack later. And it touched my heart when I was watching that, because that's part of the identity of Ukraine as a nation. Now, if we look at the current events now, we can really say that this definition of war crimes, but it depends again on the world community whether Putin will be prosecuted for war crimes. All reports in the media now is just in Filipino haka haka. So it's, or in Cebuano hungihong. So let's see what will happen in the next few weeks or few months. Now, our next topic for would be rules governing homeowners association. This is one very important um, lesson or area of the legal practice, because especially also that I'm handling homeowners association, and I am a member also of a homeowner association, and anyone listening now could be a member or of a homeowners association. So before I end, again, I want to thank the Lex Classroom likers and subscribers or followers of Facebook, and also our growing number of our Lex Classroom subscribers in YouTube. And you can share this again to the persons you know who are studying law or who might be interested in studying law. And our website, which is a work in progress again. So I'm doing some edits on the articles for those who have auditory problems. Again, I want to thank everyone and look forward because before I end, there's a demand that, or there are people asking me to provide my personal journey to the 2013 bar examinations, and I'm preparing for that. Thank you so much again, and have a happy weekend ahead. Thank you. Thank you.